My brother called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and by the time I put the phone down, I understood that my sister-in-law had just made the most costly miscalculation of her life. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, semi-retired, and I spend most of my days in a fibro cottage outside Toowoomba that needs more work than I have hours for. I've spent 4 decades in civil engineering, not the glamorous end, not the bridges and landmarks, the unglamorous end. Drainage, retention walls, the infrastructure nobody thinks about until it fails. What that work teaches you, if you do it long enough, is that the things most likely to collapse aren't the ones that look unstable. They're the ones that look perfectly fine right up until they don't. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Welcome to Whispered Truths. Pour yourself something, get comfortable, and know this: every person in this story had the chance to do the right thing. Some of them chose otherwise. Drop a comment and subscribe if you're new. You'll want to stay for this one. It was a Wednesday, just after 2 in the afternoon. My mother, Sylvia Whitmore, 79 years old, still living alone in the same weatherboard house in Ipswich she's occupied for 46 years, had called my brother first. Then my brother called me. He didn't say hello. He said, "Did you know Mum wasn't at Connor's engagement party?" I set down my tea. Connor is my nephew, my brother Patrick's eldest boy, 24 years old, finishing a graduate diploma in education up in Brisbane. He'd gotten engaged to a lovely young woman named Priya 3 months back, and her family had hosted a dinner. A proper sit-down. 40-odd people, at a function room in Paddington. I'd been there. I'd sat 2 seats down from Priya's grandmother and spent an enjoyable hour discussing the merits of various Queensland mangoes. I had assumed my mother was there. I had not checked. That was my first failure. "Patrick," I said carefully. "She wasn't invited," he said. And then he said nothing else for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. My sister-in-law is Renata Corbin Whitmore. She has been married to my brother for 22 years, and she has always been, to use the most precise word available to me, strategic. Not unkind, necessarily. Not openly hostile. Strategic. The sort of woman who remembers every favor she's done and keeps a running tally you don't know exists until the bill arrives. I had always told myself I was being uncharitable. Patrick loved her. Their kids were good kids. I had let it go, year after year. The same way you let a slow leak go because fixing it requires admitting it's there. I asked Patrick if he was certain. He said Mum called him that morning. She'd run into their neighbor, Barbara Hendricks, at the IGA on Monday. Barbara had been at the party. Barbara had shown her photos on her phone, standing in the function room with the fairy lights and the canapes, and the whole family arranged for photographs every branch of it, except one. Mum hadn't said anything to Barbara. She'd smiled and said how lovely it looked. Finished her shopping, driven home, and sat with it for 2 days before she called Patrick. 2 days. My 79-year-old mother had sat alone with that for 2 days before she said a word. I told Patrick I'd call him back. Then, I called Mum. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was steady, the way it always is. The particular steadiness of a woman who was raised to hold herself together in public and only lets the seams show with people she trusts entirely. I said, "Mum, tell me what happened." She told me. Not quickly, not dramatically. She told me the way she tells everything, methodically, with the details in order. The call from Barbara, the photos, the moment she realized Connor's engagement dinner, the one she'd bought a new blouse for, thinking the invitation was just delayed in the post, had already happened without her. And then she said something that I wrote down afterward because I wanted to remember it exactly. She said, "I'm not ringing to make a fuss, Gerald. I just want to know whether it was an oversight or a decision." I told her I'd find out. Then I asked her the question I needed to ask. Because I know my mother, and I know when she's already thinking 3 steps ahead of the conversation. I said, "Mom, is there anything else I should know?" A pause. Not a long one. The kind that means she's choosing how much to tell me, and in what order. She said, "I had a phone call last week from a man named Trevor Samuels. He said he was a financial planning consultant. He was asking about the property. Said he'd been referred by a family member who was concerned about my ability to manage it independently." The temperature in the room dropped about 5 degrees. I said, "Referred by which family member?" She said he hadn't specified, but he'd used the word concerned 4 times in a 5-minute conversation, and he'd mentioned supported living arrangements twice, without her asking once. I sat down on the back step of my cottage and looked out at the paddock and thought about my sister-in-law and her talent for running things in parallel, the visible story and the real one. Only describe as the specific cold clarity of a man who has been patient for 20 years and has just reached the end of it. I told Mum I'd be in Ipswich on Friday. She said she'd make a shepherd's pie. I said, "Don't make a fuss." She said, "It's no fuss." I was going to cook anyway. That was Thursday. I spent it making calls, quiet ones. I have a solicitor in Toowoomba, a woman named Helen Draper who has handled my affairs for 15 years and has a mind like a document scanner. Nothing gets past her, and nothing gets lost. I called Helen and told her the shape of what I was seeing. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about her. And then she asked me 3 questions. I answered them. She said she'd look into some things. I also called my cousin Denise, who lives in Ipswich 4 streets from Mum and has coffee with her every Thursday morning without fail. I asked Denise if Mum had seemed different lately. Denise said she seemed fine, sharp as ever, beating Denise at Scrabble the way she'd been doing for 30 years. Then Denise paused and said, she did mention a phone call that unsettled her, some financial bloke she didn't ask for. I told Denise I was handling it. Denise said, "I know you are. Just don't take too long." I drove to Ipswich on Friday morning. The house on Kellaway Street looked the way it always looks. The jacaranda out the front that Mum planted the year I started high school, the white weatherboard that she repaints herself every 3 years, despite the fact that I have offered to hire someone and she has declined every time. There is a stubbornness in that woman that I have spent 63 years alternatively admiring and despairing of. Mostly admiring. She had the shepherd's pie in the oven when I arrived. She was in the kitchen in her good cardigan, the burgundy one she saves for when people come over. And she had the table set with the blue placemats and the good glasses, which told me she'd been planning this conversation for longer than the phone call. I sat down. She poured tea. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Before you say anything, I want to show you something." She went to the second drawer of the kitchen dresser, the drawer that has contained, in the 30 years I've been visiting this kitchen as an adult, a combination of rubber bands, batteries of uncertain charge, takeaway menus from places that no longer exist, and the running documentation of my mother's entire administrative life, and she produced a manila folder. Inside was a business card for Trevor Samuels. Behind it, a printout of his company registration, which she had looked up herself. Behind that, a handwritten note of the exact conversation, dated, timed, with the 4 uses of the word concerned underlined in blue pen. I stared at her across the kitchen table. She said, "I wasn't always an office manager for 28 years for nothing, Gerald. I had forgotten she'd done that. Or rather, I'd known it the way you know things about your parents without fully registering what it means that the woman sitting across from me had once run the administrative operations of a mid-sized engineering firm and had done so with a precision that her employer had mentioned in her retirement speech twice. She had spent 2 decades managing documents, timelines, and difficult people. The fact that she was now 79 and widowed and living alone on Kellaway Street did not change any of that. I told her what I'd asked Helen to look into. She nodded like she'd expected as much. I said, "Mum, I need to ask you directly. Do you think Renata was behind the call from Samuels?" She picked up her tea. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "I think Trevor Samuels didn't find me by accident. And I only have one family member who has ever mentioned, more than once, that this house is a significant asset that she hoped would be managed wisely." She put the word asset in the kind of tone that meant she found the word itself to be a form of insult. I asked her when Renata had said that. She said, "Christmas, 2 years ago. Then again at Patrick's birthday last June. She mentioned a family meeting, both times. I changed the subject both times. I didn't want trouble." She paused. I should have paid more attention. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She said, "I'm not apologizing. I'm revising. That's my mother." I called Helen from the car before I drove back. She had found something. Trevor Samuels' consultancy had been referred by a third party. She'd found the connection through a mutual registration on a financial planning network cross-referenced with Renata's professional profile, which listed her as a contact for 2 of the same affiliated groups. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to understand the shape of things. Helen said she'd already drafted a recommendation. She said Mum needed to see a solicitor of her own, someone with no connection to Patrick or Renata, and she needed to do it before any further contact from Samuels or anyone like him. I said, "I've already told her that," Helen said. "Good." Then she said, "Gerald, the property and the superannuation together. Does Sylvia understand what she's actually holding?" I said, "I thought so." Helen said, "Make sure. People don't always do the maths on their own assets until someone else starts doing it for them." I drove back to Toowoomba in the dark thinking about that. Mum's house on Kellaway Street, 3 bedrooms, corner block. Ipswich was worth more than most people would assume. My father had bought it in 1974 for a figure that would make a millennial weep, and had paid it off with 20 years of early mornings and weekend shifts at the transport depot. There was also a self-managed super fund he'd set up in his late 50s that Mum had kept intact and quietly growing. She didn't talk about it. She never had. She drove a 12-year-old Corolla and bought her blouses from Miller's and spent her money on her grandchildren's birthdays and her church's annual fundraiser. To most people who looked at her, she was a sweet old woman on a pension. She was not. I called Patrick that night. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding like a man who'd been staring at the ceiling for most of the week. I told him what I'd found. I told him what Mum had told me. I told him about Samuels. The line was quiet for a long time. Then Patrick said, "I didn't know about Samuels. I believe him. My brother is not a hard man or a scheming one. He is a man who has been comfortable for a long time in a marriage where someone else does most of the planning, and he has mistaken that comfort for partnership. There is a version of him that might have woken up sooner. He didn't, but he wasn't the one who made the call." I said, "Patrick, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. Someone, and we both know who, sent a financial consultant to our 79-year-old mother's house to begin softening the ground for a competency and asset management conversation she did not ask for and does not need." He was quiet again. I said, "And Connor's engagement party? Mum wasn't there, Patrick." He said, "Renata handled the invitations." I said, "I know." He said nothing. I said, "Your son got engaged, and your mother found out from a neighbor's phone screen at the supermarket. She sat with that for 2 days before she said anything to you." I heard him exhale. It was the exhale of a man setting down something heavy that he'd been pretending wasn't there. He said, "I'll come to Ipswich." I said, "We're both going to Ipswich Saturday, and Renata is coming with you." He said, "Gerald," I said, She needs to be there, Patrick. Whatever she thought she was managing, it's already done. Mum's been to see a solicitor of her own. I need Renata to understand what that means, and I need her to hear it from Mum, not from me. He said he'd talk to her. Saturday. The house on Kellaway Street, in the flat October heat of Ipswich. The jacaranda already beginning to bud. The white weatherboard bright in the morning sun. I arrived at 10. Patrick's Land Cruiser was already in the driveway. Through the front window I could see the shape of Renata sitting at the kitchen table. Back straight, hands visible on the table. The body language of a woman who has decided that composure is her best available armor. She was not wrong. It just wasn't going to be enough. What she didn't know, what none of us knew until Mum produced it from the same reliable second drawer, was that Connor was also coming. My nephew, the young man whose engagement dinner had been used, without his knowledge, as the first step in a longer plan to sideline the woman who'd sat in the front pew at his christening. I found that out when I walked through the front door and heard his voice in the kitchen. He'd driven down from Brisbane that morning. Mum had called him Thursday night. She hadn't told Patrick. She hadn't told me. I stood in the hallway for a moment and had the specific experience of understanding that I was not, in this house, the most strategically capable person present. Mum was at the stove. Of course she was. Lamingtons on the bench, already made, the good ones with the proper chocolate coating. The kettle on. The blue placemats out again. A woman who irons the tablecloth before she takes someone apart has always been planning further ahead than the rest of the room. Connor was at the kitchen table. He's 24, long-limbed, with his father's quietness and his grandmother's eyes. He looked up when I came in and gave me a nod that was more serious than 24 usually manages. He'd been told something. Not everything, but enough to understand the room. Patrick was standing near the window, one hand on the bench. He looked like a man in the waiting room of something he'd agreed to that he now wasn't sure about. Renata looked at me when I came in and smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that's been deployed in difficult rooms before and has usually worked. I smiled back. I poured myself a coffee. I sat down across from her. Mum served tea and lamingtons. She asked Connor about Priya. She asked Patrick how the drive down had been. She asked Renata how her mother was keeping. And Renata said, "Fine. Thank you, Sylvia." And there was a fraction of a beat where Renata almost relaxed, almost believed this was just a family morning, that Sylvia Whitmore had called them all together for lamingtons and nothing else. Then Mum sat down at the head of the table. Not her usual seat, the head. My father's old chair. She doesn't sit there for ordinary meals. She sat there now, folded her hands, and the room changed. She said, "I want to talk about Connor's engagement party." Patrick looked at his coffee. Renata's expression didn't shift, but her hands moved a small adjustment, barely visible, the recalibration of someone who has just realized the ground is different than they thought. She said, "I learned about it from Barbara Hendricks on Monday morning." She showed me photos. Mum paused. It looked lovely. I wish I'd been there. Connor was very still. He'd known there was tension. I don't think he'd known the specific shape of it until that moment. He said quietly, "Grandma, you weren't invited?" Nobody answered him. He turned to his mother. Renata said, "Sylvia, the list was Priya's family's decision largely. And with the venue capacity," Mum said. "Renata, just that." Her voice was the same temperature it always is, mild, unhurried, utterly immovable. The venue held 68 people. There were 41 at the dinner. I've spoken with Priya's mother, who is a very warm woman and who was under the impression I had declined the invitation due to health reasons. The air went out of the room. Patrick looked at his wife. Renata said, "That was a miscommunication." Mum said, "Yes. I thought it might have been something like that." She reached into the pocket of the burgundy cardigan, and placed a piece of paper flat on the table. "I'd also like to discuss Trevor Samuels." Renata went very still. Mum said, "He called me on the 14th. He said he'd been referred by a family member who was concerned about my ability to independently manage my property and finances." She tapped the paper lightly. "I have the date, the time, and a full record of the conversation. My solicitor, Margaret Fenn, has a copy." The name landed like something dropped from a height. I watched Renata process it. Margaret Fenn, who is one of the most respected estate solicitors in Ipswich, whose name in that context meant only one thing: that Sylvia Whitmore had not been waiting for the problem to arrive. She'd already moved past it. Patrick said very quietly. "Renata," she said, "Patrick, I was looking out for your family's interests. Your mother is almost 80. The property, the super fund." Mum said, "There is a plan. Actually." She reached into the second drawer of the kitchen dresser. Connor watching, Patrick watching, Renata watching, and placed a second envelope on the table. She slid it across to Connor. He opened it carefully. He read it slowly. I watched his face the way I'd watched my own children's faces for years, looking for the thing underneath the visible reaction. What I saw was surprise, then understanding, then something slower and more solid settling in behind his eyes. He looked up. He said, "Gran." She said, "Your grandfather worked 31 years at that depot. I worked 28 years as an office manager. We did not spend it." She folded her hands again. "That money goes into an account in your name. Margaret has already established it. The transfer was initiated Thursday afternoon." Connor looked at his father, then at his mother, then back at his grandmother. Renata said, "Sylvia, this is..." Mum said, "I'm not finished. Love." That word, love, delivered with the same warmth and the same absolute finality as a door being closed. She said, "Margaret has also helped me restructure the property title and the super fund. Everything has been documented and filed." She was thorough. "I've also had a full cognitive assessment done at St. Andrew's Memory, reasoning, judgment, and executive function. Dr. Caroline Pham administered it last Tuesday. I performed, as she put it, well above average across all measures." Mum tilted her head slightly. "Margaret has a copy of that report attached to the estate filing as well." The kitchen was silent except for the neighbor's sprinkler ticking on somewhere down the street and a rosella that had found Mum's old feeder and was making its feelings known about the seed selection. Renata said, "I want you to know, this came from a place of genuine concern." Mum looked at her for a moment with the expression I have seen her deploy precisely 3 times in my life. It is not an angry expression. It is the expression of a woman who has heard something she does not intend to dignify with argument, and is simply waiting for the person to stop. She said, "Connor, there is a condition on the money." He straightened. "Okay, it's yours alone, not a joint account, not a family account. Margaret has structured it so that it cannot be accessed or directed by anyone but you until you instruct otherwise." She paused. "Your grandfather and I built that over 50 years. I'd like it to go somewhere. It will be used for something that matters." Connor said, "It will be, Gran. I promise you." She reached over and patted his hand. It was a small gesture, the kind that carries more weight than speeches. Renata stood up. She said, "I think we need some time to process this as a family." I said, "That sounds right." Patrick didn't move from his spot by the window. He was looking at his mother with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years. Something like recognition, the particular look of a man seeing clearly what he'd been choosing for a long time not to examine. Renata left the kitchen first. Patrick followed a few minutes later. after saying something quiet to Mum that I didn't hear. Mum touched his arm. Whatever passed between them was not mine to know. Connor stayed. The three of us sat at the kitchen table while I did what I always do at Mum's, cleared the plates and ran the hot water, which is not a skill so much as a lifetime habit, and I listened to the two of them talk. Real talk. The kind that surfaces after everything performative has been removed from the room. Connor said, "Gran, I didn't know you weren't there at the engagement dinner. I want you to know that." She said, "I know, sweetheart. I saw Mum on the phone the week before. I thought she was sorting things with Priya's parents. I didn't." He stopped. "I should have checked." She said, "You were celebrating your engagement. That is exactly what you should have been doing." A pause, warm but firm. "Don't carry what isn't yours, Connor. That is a weight that belongs elsewhere." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you okay? I mean, really?" She said, "I am 79 years old, and I have outlasted 2 recessions, a burst hot water system in the middle of winter, and your grandfather's insistence on growing pumpkins in the back garden every year, even though neither of us particularly likes pumpkin." She paused. "A phone call from a consultant I didn't ask for and a party I wasn't told about are not going to be what undoes me." He laughed, surprised into it, the way people get when something is funnier than they expected because it's also exactly true. I came out of the kitchen with the tea towel still over my shoulder and said, "She's been like this my entire life. You get used to it." Mum said, "Gerald, I can hear you." Connor looked at his grandmother for a long moment. Then he said, "What do I do with the money? I mean, I know what I want to use it for, but I mean with everything else, Dad." Mum said, "What you do with your parents is between you and them and the time you're willing to put in." She straightened her cardigan. "Your father is a good man. He made a mistake that's been compounding for a while. Whether it compounds further is up to him." She picked up her tea. "Your mother is more complicated. That I'll leave to you." He nodded slowly, looked at the envelope still on the table. He said, "Gran, this is my whole future in here," she said. "It's a start. What you make of it after that is yours." I walked Connor out to his car at 12:30. He had his keys in his hand, but he stood at the door for a moment, looking back at the house. He said, "She knew, didn't she? Before any of us." I said, "She's been 3 moves ahead since at least 1987, which is the year the back fence blew down in a storm, and she'd already called the fencer before Dad knew the fence was down." He almost smiled. "Grandpa didn't notice?" He noticed when the bill arrived. She'd already paid it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the jacaranda beginning to flower. He said, "Is Dad going to be all right?" I said, "Your father is a decent man who got comfortable and stopped watching. That's a recoverable thing. But it requires him to do the work, and I can't tell you whether he will. What I can tell you is that I'll be keeping an eye on things." He said, "And Mum?" I looked at my nephew. This 24-year-old with the whole of his life ahead of him and his grandmother's paperwork in his hand. And I chose honesty. I said, "That's above my pay grade, mate. But Mum knows what she's involved in, and so do you, now." He nodded, shook my hand, which turned into a half hug the way it does with the young blokes in our family, all of us too proud to commit fully. He got in his car, backed out of the driveway. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend on Kellaway Street. I went back inside. Mum was at the kitchen bench making another pot of tea. The lamington plate had been covered with cling wrap. The kitchen was clean. She had her back to me, and she was humming something I didn't recognize, low and without particular drama, the way she hums when she is by herself and content. I said, "You could have told me you'd invited Connor." She said. I could have, I said. Why didn't you? She said. Because I needed to see how everyone behaved when they thought it was just the four of us, and I needed Connor to hear it without knowing it was coming. She turned around. You would have prepared a face. You always prepare a face, Gerald. It was more useful for you not to. I didn't have an argument for that. She was right, and we both knew it, I said. What did you actually say to Margaret Fenn? What exactly did you restructure? She looked at me with the exact same expression she used when I was 15 and asked what she'd said to the school principal. She said, My finances are my own business, Gerald. I said, Mum. She said, I'll tell you that the house and the fund are both properly protected, and that the people who might have thought otherwise have a very long and expensive road ahead of them that leads nowhere I intend to go. She handed me my tea. I'll also tell you that I've left enough in liquid accounts to be comfortable for the next 20 years, and I've already prepaid the church fair contribution for the next 3, because I like to plan ahead. I stood in my mother's kitchen in Ipswich, holding a mug of 2-strong tea, and felt something I don't have a better word for than right. Not triumphant, not relieved. Exactly. Something quieter and more durable than either. The particular feeling of watching a woman who was never fragile refuse, one final time, to be treated as though she was. Mum said, Stay for lunch. I said, I wasn't planning to. She said, I have leftover shepherd's pie. I stayed. I drove back to Toowoomba in the late afternoon, the sun low and gold over the range, the radio playing something from the 90s that I couldn't name but knew every word to. My phone buzzed at the top of the range. A message from Connor. Just called Priya, told her what happened. She cried. Said Gran deserved to be at every table. Then, a minute later, Priya's already texted Gran to ask if she'd like to come for dinner next week. Gran said yes and asked what she should bring. I put the phone down and drove. I thought about my father, a man who spent 31 years in the transport depot and another 20 watching his garden, and never once made noise about what he'd built. He'd left it to a woman he trusted with it completely. Knowing I believe this, that if anyone ever came for it, she would be the last person they'd want to have miscalculated. I thought about the people who'd looked at Sylvia Whitmore on Kellaway Street and seen an old woman alone in a 3-bedroom house with a superannuation fund she probably didn't fully understand, and decisions that probably needed managing by people better placed to manage them. They had not seen what I grew up watching. They'd seen the Corolla and the miller's blouses and the landline and the second drawer full of rubber bands. They had not seen the woman who'd been running documentation systems since before they were born. They had not seen the folder. Thanks for watching. They had not seen the folder. They had not seen the card for Margaret Fenn, already in hand before the first phone call had even been returned. That was the only mistake that mattered. The one you make when you assume that quiet means unaware, that age means diminished, that a woman who doesn't raise her voice has nothing left to say. Sylvia Whitmore was 79 years old. She had a clean cognitive report, an airtight estate, and a great-grandson whose future was locked in an account nobody could reach. All Renata had was a financial consultant in a network directory who was about to have a very unproductive Monday morning. I almost felt sorry about that. I did not feel sorry about that. There are things this story asks us to sit with long after it ends. That the people who love us are not made less capable by the years they carry often. They are made more so. That the assumption of fragility in the elderly is sometimes a genuine mistake, but it is never a harmless one. That family is not a word that grants entitlement. And a bloodline is not a deed of ownership over someone else's life and work. And this. The quietest people at the table are sometimes the ones who have already finished the conversation you think you're only just beginning. If this story moved something in you or reminded you of someone, share it with them. Subscribe to Whispered Truths If you're new here, there are more stories coming, and they're all worth your time. And as always, thank you for listening.